In this movie, we're going to talk about testing in Rails. Well, what is testing? Well, the good news is that you're already testing your applications. You just didn't know it. When you write a controller action, design a view for it, then load it up in your web application to see if you got the results you expected, that's testing. When you fill out a form and you submit it to the application and then check the database to see if the data was saved, that's also testing. You regularly poke and prod your application to make sure that your code does what it should. And if it doesn't, you change the code and you test it again. Now, how many times have you reloaded pages while building an application? How many times have you filled out forms with fake data? It's a repetitive and time-consuming task, but it's essential when we're programming. You know what's really good at repetitive, time-consuming tasks? Computers are. And that's the idea behind writing test code. Instead of clicking on a link to make sure that you see the expected page results, you write test code so the computer will request the URL and check the results for you. Tests are code that tests your application code. There are a lot of benefits to writing tests. The first is that you spend less time testing. Because computers are faster than you, they can run hundreds, if not thousands of tests with just a single command, and they can do it all while you go off and do something else. You also get more accurate testing because computers make less mistakes than you do. And faster debugging because when an error does pop up, it'll tell you exactly the file and the line of code where that error popped up. Writing tests will also cause you to write better code because you'll have to stop and think about what does this code do and what are the different things that could go wrong so that I can test for them. And that forces you to reconsider your assumptions. It makes you say, what if this argument that I was expecting to be an array, what if it turns out that it's an integer or a string? How will that impact the results? And perhaps the most important point about tests is that tests give you confidence. You know that your code works if the tests pass. You don't have to wonder. You know the computer has checked everything for you and all your tests are running fine. If a customer comes to you and says, hey, we'd like you to add a new feature to our application, you go in, you add the new feature. If all the tests pass, then you know you didn't accidentally break something somewhere else while you were adding the feature. Otherwise, without tests, you might have guessed that you didn't break anything or hoped that you didn't break anything, but you don't know with certainty that you didn't break something in some distant part of the application with the change you made. And they also let you be confident when you're upgrading Rails, gems, or plugins, you can know that the new version doesn't break anything in your code. If a new version of Rails comes out in your development environment, you can try out that version with your code, run all your tests. If they all pass, then you know that your application is compatible with that new version. You don't just have to install it and then wait for something to go wrong. Now, there are a couple of downsides to testing. There's three. First, it takes time to learn how to write tests. You're going to have to spend a little time learning the language of testing. The second is that it takes time to write those tests. We're not just writing our application code, now we're spending additional time writing code that tests that code. And then the third one is just that it takes experience. It takes time to learn how to write great tests. Now, the reason why this is important is that you might write some tests, but if you didn't test everything, if you tested 75% of the things that could have gone wrong, you still might have bugs in there. All your tests are passing, so you have a false sense of security, thinking that you've tested everything. But once you know how to write great tests and how to really have test coverage for everything, well, then you can really have that confidence that you know you didn't break anything. So that's it. The big downside is time. For just the investment of your time, you get back a ton of benefits. Now, what parts of your application should you be testing? Well, the answer is anything that you want to work. You should test everything and you should be paranoid. Because our application code is broken up in MVC, we can also break our tests up in the same way. Let's look at the most common types of tests. There's unit testing, which is designed mostly to test our models. There's functional testing for testing controllers and views or requests. Then there's integration testing, where we're really testing series of requests or user stories. Performance testing, where we're testing how fast our application performs. Load testing, where we're testing what kind of a request load our application is able to handle. And then security testing, where we're testing for security vulnerabilities. Now, as a developer, you should be concerned about all of these topics. But for writing tests to automate the testing process, you should start at the top. Fixing a problem in your models could solve problems in the other 5. Now, most Rails developers focus on automating the first 2 or 3, and then skip the others or just do periodic checks. You'll have to decide for yourself what your needs are. For example, our simple CMS application could benefit a lot from having unit and functional tests, and performance, load, and security tests probably aren't worth the time it takes to write them. But on the other hand, if we were going to create a CMS tool as a business that Fortune 500 companies would depend on, well, then suddenly we need to pay attention to all 6 of them. Now, Rails tries to make testing as easy for you as possible. It gives you a test directory in every application that has subdirectories already in it for unit, functional, integration, and performance tests. We already have a configuration for a test database. When you generate a model or a controller, Rails creates a corresponding file in the test directory that's ready for you to fill out with your tests. There are several rake tasks that are built in to help you run your tests. And then by default, Rails uses Test Unit, the testing framework that's included with Ruby, so that there's nothing additional for you to install. They've really made every effort to try and lower the barriers and make testing as easy for you as possible. Now, I mentioned Test Unit already. That's the testing framework that comes with Ruby, but there's a number of other popular testing tools that people use. And I just want to give you a list of them to just kind of expose you to them. You can go out and do research and find out what each one of them does and see if one of them might be better for you. Some of them are replacements for Test Unit that you would use in place of it. Some can be used with it or with each other. You can kind of mix and match among these. So Test Unit, RSpec, Selenium, Water, Cucumber, WebRat, Mocha, Shoulda, Arcove, and Autotest. Now, if you don't have a strong preference, go ahead and get started with Test Unit because it really will introduce you to the basics of it, and then you'll be able to graduate to some of these others later on. Now, there's one more aspect of testing that's popular that you should also know about, and that is writing tests even before you write the code. Of course, at first those tests are going to fail, but they contain an expression of what your desired goal state in your application is. And then you keep writing and modifying your code until all your tests are passed. When all the tests pass, you know that you're done. This is called test-driven development or behavior-driven development, often seen abbreviated as just TDD or BDD. So some developers do develop this way. They start with their tests, then they write code. Others don't. Others write their code and then they write the test. It's really a matter of personal preference. If you want to learn more about how to write tests, the Ruby on Rails guides are a great place for you to get started. Those are at guides.rubyonrails.org, and the page is testing.html. These will walk you through the basics of using Test Unit and provide links to other resources about testing that you can look into. So my advice with regards to testing would be to first get a good grasp on developing in Rails, make sure that you have an understanding of the Ruby language and the Rails framework, and then once you do, you'll be ready to graduate to testing your code.